Hey everybody. A couple quick notes before starting today's episode. First off, this week's 5-star review written by Moonlight Swim 96 titled My Two Cents. Moonlight Swim 96 says, I'm a nursing student and listening to this podcast helps me understand the population of people who use substances and their points of view. I am an advocate for education and understanding of all viewpoints, and I think this podcast is bias-free. Thank you so much, Moonlight Swim 96. The second and final thing on the list is I've been receiving a lot of emails with stories and feedback about Psychotropic. I just wanted to give thanks. The fact is I read every one of them, and what you guys have to say, the stories that you share, are, quite frankly, pretty amazing. Oftentimes hilarious. Thank you so much for taking the time. If you're interested in writing in or sharing a story, you can do that at www.psychotropicpodcast.com. If you value the show and would like to show your support, you can do that in a number of ways. However, the easiest is to leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. The support is so appreciated. Having said all that, here's today's show. I hope you enjoy. Thanks again, everybody.
In my life experience, I experienced things that I interpreted as constraint. And so being human, I push against things that feel constraining. And what I've learned to do is create environments where there's open communication, because there is this freedom with exchange of ideas that you don't have when someone feels they want to be powerful and hold back information. And that, to me, that feels like constraint. It feels very disrespectful. I actually have a book about gremlins that came out of my experience with my husband. We had separated for 5 months. And at that time, I thought, well, I got 20 years into this thing. I really need to attempt a reconciliation. I kind of owe it, and to find out if it'll work. And he made a lot of laudy promises about how things would be different. Well, within probably a week to 10 days, he came in the house with a friend of his, and he said, oh, Frank's been kicked out of his girlfriend's apartment. Can he stay in our attic? And the guy is standing right there. So I say, okay. And so within a week, he had moved his pregnant girlfriend in, along with his chow, full-grown chow dog. And because the lifestyle he and my husband had, which had nothing around employment, but mostly just going to the tavern, sitting all day, and then coming home at 2 o'clock in the morning and folding down these attic stairs and making a lot of racket, and I had to get up at 5 to go do my job. So, and then food was disappearing, and and there would be bigger messes. And the thing that Frank had said was, I will be invisible. You won't even know I'm here. So my eldest daughter was home from college, and she and I started referring to these people in the attic as the gremlins. And in order to deal with our own angst about having them there, we started writing this story. We wrote this story about a small child who is new in the neighborhood and anxious and fearful and friendless, and goes to the park and meets a gremlin who invites himself home, basically. Says, I have no home, and the child says, well, you can stay in my attic till you find another place. Oh, I'll be invisible, the gremlin tells the little girl. But the gremlin isn't invisible and wreaks havoc in her life to the point where she's getting in all sorts of trouble. And she learns when she runs into an elder gremlin in the park that this is what gremlins do. This is their nature. They wiggle their way into your life and they wreak havoc. And the only way to get rid of them is if you invited them in, you need to invite them out.
Psychotropic presents The Gremlin. How did you meet your husband?
In church. I was at church, and it was a small congregation that was full of young, what we called in the day, Jesus freaks. They were all young adults, and everyone seemed to be pairing off, because that's apparently what you do when you're a young adult and you're in a church and you want to have sex. You have to get married. And so, I mean, that wasn't spoken out loud, but that's what you do. So this church full of young people, a lot of them, well, they weren't exactly homeless, but maybe aimless. And so the elders of the church decided to start buying and renting houses to house all these young people. And so they would appoint a man as the house steward and a woman as the kitchen steward. And it kind of irks me just a little to think that really happened to me. And I didn't want to be left out of this movement, so I told one of the elders I wanted to move in with this couple that I knew. And they said, no, we want you to move into the house of sunshine. And so I moved into the house of sunshine, and the house head was this fella named Jim, and he was in charge of the tape ministry. Well, it was in the day of cassette tapes. So he recorded the music and the people that came to preach and things like that. So that was his gig, and that was apparently a very important gig because he had a lot of status. And he and I and 3 or 4 other people moved into this great big house. After a few months, he and I both felt that everyone in the house was crazy except for us. And so we spent time together, and we eventually ended up getting married. I think we were married maybe a couple years before he fell away from the church. I think his thing was he didn't like to be told what to do. But he had this antipathy toward authority, so it makes sense. And so almost every job situation, he'd get in some issue with the authority. And I always supported him in it because I have antipathy for authority too. I always question authority. It could have been the era we were raised in. Neither one of us liked Richard Nixon.
What attracted you to him?
Well, he wasn't ugly. I think that he really had a good sense of humor and a good sense of the absurd. It was fortunate that he was good looking, because now I have good looking kids. What was adverse were things that came out much later.
What did his substance use look like?
Probably, we'd probably been married a couple years and had small children, and then he started to drink. And when he wanted to drink, he would always invite me to do it, which was kind of like the asking for a permission slip, or raising your hand to go to the potty at school. It's like, you're an adult, but there was something that prevented him from going further without getting special permission. And I think it was his experience, if it wasn't something else in his youth. Anyway, so once we weren't a part of this religious organization anymore, he started to drink more often and started to disappear. And in 1980, my youngest son had been born, and he was like 7 months old. I remember this very vividly because it was the weekend John Lennon was shot. Jim decided he didn't want to live with me anymore. He needed a break, he said. And he had been partying with some folks and met someone that he had invited him to stay with her. And so I helped him pack his stuff, and I said, okay. And I had 4 wee ones that were like age 4.5 to a babe in arms. And, you could pick up a clue. But after like 4 or 5 days, he said, okay, well, I want to come home. And I was like, okay. But I was very young and very in love with love and very forgiving, but also like very naive about substance abuse. It was something in my father's family history, and subsequently my mother in her 30s and 40s started drinking. So eventually she started using prescription narcotics, and so there's a lot of substance abuse in my family history, but I was really naive about it and very judgmental about, people that abuse substances. But Jim's was real intense, and there was quite a variety of different substances. He was most open about drinking, but he was arrested a couple years before we were divorced for having some kind of substance. I don't know what it was, some controlled substance.
What was his relationship with LSD?
Oh, his relationship with LSD went way back to the heyday of Haight-Ashbury, when he was in the Army and decided Vietnam was not the place for him. So he went AWOL probably, I think it was at least 3 times, just out of basic training. And he ended up in the Haight-Ashbury area. And so it was in and around the Summer of Love. And so that it was part and parcel of that experience of living in that area. So that's when he was really introduced to psychedelics. Anymore, there is a therapeutic use being evaluated for psychedelics, but when he was doing it, it was bad. It had a bad label. It had a naughty label.
What did he say about LSD?
He explained having an epiphany of sorts on one trip, and indicated that it had been life-altering experience. And following that, he ran into someone who was, in the day, we referred to them as Jesus freaks. And he went from being kind of a freewheeling individual into this very structured young churchy organization, and that lasted a couple years.
At the time, can you describe how you felt about LSD?
I'm kind of ambivalent to it. I made a personal choice, to avoid mind-altering substances. Not that I didn't. I smoked dope in high school because I had an older brother and sister, and we partied on the weekend, and that was part of the gig. But I never was a big fan of it.
Why didn't you want to try it?
Well, I've been reflecting on this a lot over the last year or so. I had a mental health episode that ended up in the hospital last May. And during 3 times during a 9-day stay, I had what's termed a dissociative disorder, a dissociative fugue, which basically meant like a catatonic state where I couldn't move or speak, but I was completely coherent about what went on. And if you're familiar with this Edgar Allan Poe and his tremendous fear of being buried alive, it was kind of like that, not being able to convey to people that I was actually alive. At one point, the second time, I was discovered, I guess you could say, by a nurse who called EMTs, who assumed that, now even though I was in the hospital, right, in a contained ward, that I had somehow gotten an opiate overdose, so they gave me Narcan. And I was not able to say, no, that's not the case. And it really, I'd never been incapacitated like this before. It was really, really frightening. I realized, reflecting on that I have a tremendous fear of feeling constraint, and of any kind, whether it's physical constraint or emotional constraint. And it was just exacerbated by being in an abusive marriage. So the idea of being under the influence of something that I couldn't stop had a sense of constraint to me. And so that's why I resisted. At the time, I put on this Puritan ethic and said, no, that's a bad thing. But in retrospect, it was because I don't like having feeling constrained in any way, being out of control.
Why did he want you to try it?
I kind of think that he wanted me to try it the same reason a lot of people gravitate toward groups that reinforce their belief system or their choices, whether it means going to a church or going to a bar or whatever. People want to gravitate toward people that will reinforce their choice or their lifestyle. And I think that was it. In our relationship, I was probably the most important person to him. And to have me validate that by participating, and I'm totally projecting. I think it would have brought some validation. I don't think he may have considered doing me a favor and broadening my experience, but I don't think the underlying motivation was that. Because then, if you want to do that, you invite somebody to participate. You don't do it to them when behind their back.
Could you describe the scenario?
Okay, well, I hate to say, you say it was a dark and stormy night, but it was a dark and wintry night. And I remember that because he offered to fix a warm beverage for me, which was unusual for him, but and a kindness. And so he did, and I didn't think much of it. So um, he seemed more attentive to me than usual in retrospect. And I really did not experience anything other than an inability to sleep, which made me really irritable, which is why I stopped smoking marijuana as a teenager, because I couldn't sleep. For some people, it makes them sleepy. I have no idea. I never talk to folks about their experience with LSD. So I don't know if it impacts other people the same way that it did me, but I didn't have any hallucinations. I've since had more, since that time, I've had more audio hallucinations, uh, but I was taking psychotropic drugs that were prescribed for me. Um, and it wasn't until the next morning that he told me that he had put acid in my tea. I was infuriated. And it wasn't about the drugs, it was about the deceit. Um, I think I use an analogy of a roller coaster, and that, you can invite somebody to ride a roller coaster with you, or you could strap them in against their will. And I felt like I'd been strapped into a roller coaster against my will. That it was a deceit. And I have the same feeling about infidelity, that it has nothing to do with having sex with somebody else that you're not married to or not in a relationship with, but it has to do with the deceit, and it has to do with breaking your word. And those are things that I don't find tolerable. And my whole feeling about constraint and aversion to it is why I go out of my way to have open communication with people. Because I feel like when someone withholds information from you, it doesn't give you the liberty to make informed choices. So the incident with the LSD and him was just one of a handful of ones that where I felt that I had been deceived, and it was the greatest heartbreak. I have no qualms about people, and I would encourage people to, in a therapeutic environment, in exploring hallucinogens to see, because from my understanding, they can allow people a breakthrough and experience introspection, that because of our nature to be defensive and put up a facade of normalcy, allows us to go inside and explore those things that we tend to hide. And so I'm all for that, because it's much better than sitting in a therapist's office for 5 or 8 or 12 years waiting for the sky to open up, which is not likely to if you don't open up to it, right? So, but if a therapist was to slip somebody some LSD, they would lose their license. Why? Because you don't do that kind of shit.
What did you learn from that experience?
I learned not to trust him. There was a similar incident. I was first learning to drive. I was like 25 years old. I was learning to drive, driving toward Aloha, a suburb of Portland. And we're going to his mother's house. And he didn't feel like I was going fast enough. So he reached his foot over, he was in the passenger side, and tromped over on my foot on the throttle. That was, I was equally infuriated because that too was a violation. And it was like, he knew I was going slow because I was afraid. And it wasn't like I was going 20 miles an hour in a 50 mile an hour zone. I was probably doing 35 or 40, and I was in the slow lane, you know. And I just pulled over and I said, "Now you drive, because I won't drive. That's not okay." And so, those outside all the substance abuse and pulling him up out of the gutter and cleaning up wino barf and all this other stuff. Those two instances violated my integrity to the point where they really stuck in the craw of my memory, thinking, like, that will never happen to me again. I won't allow myself, my integrity, my safety to be violated again because someone doesn't like my behavior and wants to correct me, or thinks I need to have a certain experience or go a certain speed. You know, it doesn't honor the fact that I'm a unique individual. Same reason I never was in the Army. I resist being told what to do, and expect, if I don't put those expectations on somebody else, that they won't put them on me in exchange. So I learned to be more independent. I learned to speak up. I learned to not tolerate invasions of my person and property, and I learned much more about keeping safe, who to trust and who not to trust. In our family, we refer to people who come into your life and with the promise of that they're going to be your pal and then wreak havoc. We refer to them as gremlins. And all the adults I know who have ever invited someone to stay in their home understand what it's like to have a gremlin in your house. Because what they do is they violate your sanctuary. And when you don't have a place where you can just chill, that feels safe, then there is no place to deal with the stressors of the day. And you internalize that stress, and it makes you sick. So you have to get rid of your gremlins. And when you invite them in, you have to invite them out. It's just the way it goes. But at the end of the day, that's very self-empowering to acknowledge that, yeah, I'm responsible for letting this person in. Even though I was really vulnerable when I did it, I know now that I don't feel safe around them.
This episode was produced by me, Philip Johnson. All songs used can be found in the description section of this episode. If you liked what you heard today, please subscribe. Also, rate and leave a review on iTunes. It goes a really, really long way. If you'd like to become a patron of Psychotropic, or if you'd like to check out some psychotropic-related swag, or if you have a story to share, you can do all of this at psychotropicpodcast.com. If you're interested in getting a better idea about upcoming episodes, be sure to follow Psychotropic on Instagram at Psychotropic Podcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening, everybody. See you next time.